Phone?
Ron is on.
Yeah, he's here.
Okay, very good. All right, sorry for the lateness with the city manager. Let's rise for the Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. I have one speaker slip for public comment under item 2, public comment. Glenn Gelino.
To the flag of the United States and to the republic stands one nation.
We're taped already, so he doesn't.
Indivisible with liberty
Well,
and
you tell him,
justice
sir,
for all.
Tell him, Ron. Excuse me, Glenn, I'm sorry. Somebody.
Councilmember Collins, I just want to let you know that we're tape delayed, so we did the pledge about 10 seconds earlier than you did.
Yeah.
So if you're watching the stream, we're ahead of you.
He probably got not to watch the stream.
Nice.
Because you can hear it. He's got to turn down the volume. It's like being on the radio.
Yes.
Okay.
Councilmember Collins, I just want to let you know that we're tape delayed. We did the pledge about 10 seconds earlier than you did. So if you're watching the
We're
stream,
doing that. Can I have some water, please?
Ron, this is Jeff. If you could, you're going to need to turn down your computer because of the feedback that we're getting. Thank you.
Seems electrons are defying physics today. I wanted to stand before you again today and just urge you to respect the will of the people in your decision this afternoon.
This is really...
The appointment of a temporary council member should be for the shortest period of duration possible.
Glenn, I'm sorry. May I interrupt you?
Certainly.
You have yourself down as item 2, which is just public comment. And I think you want to speak on item 3A, the item
My
we're in discussion.
apologies. I thought it was a single sheet of paper.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So I'll make the comment twice. I'll come back for 2.
Yeah, you can come up. You can come up later and speak on the, because public comment is for items that are not on the posted agenda, and just to stay with our traditional way of doing this.
Okay, then I'll reiterate something I've said previously during
Okay.
this moment of
All right,
public comment. I again urge the council to reconsider the necessity for an assistant city manager. As you know, I brought the issue of the city's membership of ICLEI to you previously, and Mr. Moira flat out lied to you. I think that was demonstrated by a video Mr. Grocott showed you. I recognize that some of you didn't hear the audio of that video, so I'm in the process of recapturing that so I can replay it for you. And I would give you due consideration, or ask that you give due consideration to helping the city's budget by looking to eliminate that position, since the validity of information that he provides to you cannot be trusted. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, is there anybody else here that would like to speak under public comment items that are not on the posted agenda? Okay, seeing none, then we'll move on to new business and the consideration of a call for election, special election for either 2012, November 2012 or November 2013. Ron, can you hear me, what I'm saying okay? Mr. Collins. We can't hear him.
He's got to turn the video off. I'm sorry. Ron? Hello?
yes.
Ron, turn the video off. Turn the streaming off. Please.
I muted it.
You can't watch it because you're going to... Did you hear Mayor Grocott ask you a question?
No, I didn't, but I turned the video sound off.
Okay, just don't
But-
watch the video.
Yeah, watching the video is going to confuse you.
Okay.
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 I hear you.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, I suppose we don't have any staff presentation on this item. Do we? We do, because, yeah, now that I think about it, Mr. Rubens was going to report to us on his findings. So let's start with that.
Okay, thank you, Mayor Grocott. I was asked to look into what the default date would be if the council, if the 2-2 tie continues on the selection of the date. And my opinion is that the default would be that we would not have called an election as required by the code, and therefore the time for action would have passed, and the default would, in essence, because of the lack of action, would be the November 2013 next general municipal election. There has, though, part of my research, though, turned up that there was a recent change in state law that would give you more time to make that decision. Our municipal code states the old rule, which was that you had 30 days to call the election. Since that recent change, it's now 60 days, which would mean today is not your last day to make that decision, but you would have until June 17, which would be 60 days from the resignation of former Mayor Klein.
Would be, what's the exact date then? June what?
June 17, 2012, I think, is the 60 days from the April 18th resignation date.
Okay. So we have, and we do have a couple of council meetings between now and then.
That's correct.
How many council meetings do we have, Mr. City Manager? I just met with you and we talked about them, but
That would be, yeah, we've got two. We've got, I think it's May 29th, if I'm not mistaken, and June 11th.
June 11th, okay. Okay, so we'll put that down. So why don't we do a roundhouse first and see what this information and what the time between our last council meeting and now has, what effect it's had on council members and their decisions or their opinions. Do you want to start with Mr. Collins out there in Florida? Give him a chance. Ron?
I think I'd like to hear the other comments first, and just having a little trouble hearing every word that's been spoken.
Very good. Okay. All right. So who wants to start?
Mr. Mayor, I'll start. I think, like all of us, I've spent a lot of time thinking about what we discussed on Monday night. I guess the short answer to your question about, has it caused me to revise my position on wanting to have an earlier election? The answer to that at this point is no. I do have a suggestion to make. Perhaps after we've gone through this round of talking about our, what our current positions are, which I think might be of interest to the council, but I'll defer that until after we have everybody talk, if that's okay.
It's okay. Yeah, sure. It's fine.
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Ron, did you not hear what I said? Ron? Councilmember Collins.
Yes. Can you hear me on it? I was having trouble with my audio. Like I wasn't hearing what you were saying. Hello?
Ron, can you talk from a landline?
Yes, I can.
Would you do that, please? Because the cell phone is not going to work as well.
I agree. Should I call that number?
Christine, you got a number for him to call?
What's the number?
Do you want to call this number?
Yes,
Call
650-802-41.
Hold on just a second. Can I have you call this number and just ask for my room? Or does that not work?
Didn't you tell
Yeah,
me?
you can try to do that.
Okay. All right. Let me give you my number.
Yeah, let me just take it down.
Okay. Let me know when you're ready.
Well, we'll just have to be patient because This is the nature of call-in, you know. Yeah. We'll wait.
So what's the number?
It's area code 904
Yeah.
296 2828.
What's the room number?
The room number.
It's 204.
Let me just repeat that. It's 904-296-2828, and your room number is 204.
That's correct.
Okay. We'll call you right back.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I remember doing this one time. I did it one time, yeah.
What must have been
It was early on in my council career.
Set up, but it works.
Yeah, it can
That's something
happen.
I want to do every week. But.
It's a news day at the Courtyard by Marriott, Jacksonville, Butler Boulevard. This is Amanda. How may I help you?
Hi, Amanda. Would it be possible to speak to Mr. Collins, room 204, please?
204, I'd be delighted to transfer your call. Please hold.
Thank you.
Beverage options and high conveniences, including HGTV and free Wi-Fi. And our interactive Go board lets you check out news.
Hello?
Mr.
much
Collins?
better.
Yes.
Now, the question is, can he hear us?
Can you hear us okay?
Ron, can you hear us?
Can you hear us, Ron?
Yes, I can.
Great. Thank you.
It's almost like you're here now.
Almost like you're here.
Mr. Mayor, should I briefly repeat my
Yes,
comments?
yes.
Ron, what I said before we changed the hookup here to improve it was the mayor had asked that we start by just indicating if there had been any changes in council member position since Monday night. And what I said was I'm still desirous of seeing an earlier rather than a later election, but that I have a suggestion that I think may be a useful compromise that I would present after people had a chance to answer the mayor's question.
Okay.
So, you want to go next, Ron? Do you mind?
Where do you want me to go?
You go ahead.
Okay.
Okay.
Through the chair. You know, I haven't had a change of mind either, and it's just difficult for me to balance off the dollars, the $40,000 to $50,000, and also I really believe there's going to be a bigger and a better pool of applicants for this position relative to running for a one-year position. So,
Ron, your turn.
You hear me all right?
Yes, we can hear you fine. It's great.
Yeah, I've evaluated what I consider to be all the options. There's basically four options. One was to go with an election this November. One is obviously go next November. One is have an election next November really with no restriction on running, and then the other one is a restriction on running. And I know that for our purposes right now, we're just talking about whether or not to have an election this November or next November. And after talking with a lot of people and evaluating, I really still think that it's best that we go with the regularly scheduled election next year. And I haven't found any compelling reason that changes my mind.
Okay, very good. Mr. Olbert, do you want to offer your...
Did you want to, or I don't remember, had you indicated what your...
I haven't, but yeah, my position is the same, but I too am willing to offer up some ideas and what I feel, coming from my point of view, is a compromise.
Okay.
But so I have the same position, but I do have a compromise position I'm willing to put out there.
Would you like me to present my thoughts, or do you want to present yours, or?
Why don't you go ahead with yours first?
Can I ask a question just for a second?
Sure, go ahead.
Is there any way to turn up your volume so that I can hear you better?
If we talk into the microphone, is that better?
Yes, it is.
Okay. So.
All right. So Ron, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I'll try and remember to project. basically, let me outline the gist of where I think we are, at least in listening to the comments that were made by my colleagues on Monday, and I'll get into my idea at the end of it. I understand that there's a strong desire on the part of certain council members to want to make sure that we reduce the rate of turnover and increase the stability, basically, of the council by not having an opportunity or having situations where there could be, more faces rotating through the council than might otherwise be the case. I may not personally value that as high a risk as others, but I certainly appreciate the importance of that. And I think there are a lot of people in our community that appreciate that too. I mean, I've certainly heard from folks who feel that the need for providing stability and continuity and to the extent possible experience through an appointment, that's a very valuable thing. On the other hand, I would say that there's also the feeling, which I know I expressed and Mayor Grocott had expressed, that it's important that we give people an opportunity, the voters an opportunity as soon as we reasonably can to make their choice, because ultimately that's who really decides who's up here, is the people we represent. One of the things that can happen, based on what the City Council has determined after further research, is that if we don't reach a decision here either today or by June 17th to hold an earlier election, then by default the election will be the regularly scheduled one in November of 2013. However, that's an independent decision for whether or not there actually will be an appointment, because the two aren't linked. And so there's always the possibility, and I wouldn't say I don't know whether this would happen or not, but there's always the possibility that we don't have an earlier election, and the end result of it is also that we don't have an appointment that goes in, we don't appoint somebody to fill the vacancy, so that we end up operating with a short number for 18 months. I'm not saying that will happen. I think, as I indicated, and I don't want to speak for him, but my recollection is that I think Mayor Grocott had indicated that I know I will, given my preference for having an earlier election, I will tend to have a much higher and tighter screen on the candidates that we would be appointing for a longer period of time. So it's certainly a possibility. The gist of my idea is actually pretty simple. I think we can address the desire to have stability and a higher level of experience and be able to hit the ground running by doing two things. One would be to hold it, and at the same time still giving the voters a chance to weigh in sooner rather than later. And that would be as follows. What we would do is call the election for this November 2012, but agree that we will be looking to appoint a former city council person, in other words, somebody with experience, to the position to serve between now and the election. I think that touches on, addresses at least in part, the desire for some stability and some immediate experience and immediate ability to hit the ground running. It also preserves the people's right to weigh in on the matter at a reasonably early period of time. In fact, as early as they can under law. And I personally am not too concerned about whatever unearned incumbency issue there might be for somebody that we appointed for 5 or 6 months, both because it's only for 5 or 6 months, and because, frankly, if we limit ourselves to looking at folks who are have the experience that I was talking about, they already have a certain degree of incumbency because they used to be incumbents. So that's the gist of the idea. And in order to, in the spirit of compromise, let me also say that if it's acceptable to my colleagues to move down that kind of path, I am prepared personally to support any former city council member that my colleagues find a reasonable candidate to join us for the 5 or 6 months. And further, to also say, by the way, that I would hope that we would not ask whoever we interview, because I would expect we might very well interview a number of former people as candidates. I would not even ask them whether or not they were planning on running this November. If we can have an earlier election, I'm happy to go with a more experienced person to join us for 5 or 6 months. And I'm also happy to basically say if they want to run in November, that's fine. Because I think it's important that we try and find some compromise that we can move forward on this and, you know, not run the risk of ending up with 4 people up here for 18 months. So that's the idea.
One question. You had said there were two parts to this. So the first part was call for election 2012, and the second part was no limit on whether they run as an incumbent or not in 2012. Is that the second part?
Actually, the second part's a little more involved than that. It's a combination of no limit on whether they run in 2012, but also that I would be happy, speaking for myself, I would be happy to support, and in fact I would urge my colleagues to consider that we focus on former council members.
I see.
For the candidate pool. Or at least folks who have a significant amount of government experience as elected officials. I mean, I could see that if somebody felt strongly that we wanted to have a somewhat larger pool. But that's part of the, you know, my preference would be, Mr. Mayor, not to have that latter constraint. But part of it's the spirit of compromise. Part of it's recognizing that while I may not be as concerned about the stability and experience argument as others, I think it's a valid argument. So.
Okay, very good. Any discussion on Mark's proposal? Or would you like to hear, since I'm the one who's offered also a compromise position, I could float that as well, if you like.
Personally, I'd like to hear yours, Mr. Mayor, and then we could make a comment on both of them.
Ron, you okay with that?
Yes, I am.
Okay, so just to restate that my position, my first and primary position is to hold an election in 2012. Where I'm willing to compromise is to go with the date of 2013. And when it comes to the appointment, however, for an 18-month or 16 to 18 months duration, that we do include the condition, albeit it can't be a legal standing, but we do, like we've done in the past, and have the condition that the 18-month appointed person to the council not run in 2013, November of 2013. The reason I'm holding that position is because I know for a fact, from having met with one at least, that there are former council members who are looking to get back on the council. And before any of this happened, we're simply looking at a campaign period in November of 2013. Those people, in my mind, already have the asset, if you will, of having been on the council before. If we were to appoint somebody like that, now they have their asset of being on the council formally, the asset of being on the council currently, and having been given the blessing of this council to serve for 18 months. And that's I see that as a seal of approval. And furthermore, if a person like that, if we were to create a situation like that, and in the event that Mr. Grisilli or myself decide not to run in the fall of 2013, I'm afraid our appointment would not merely be an appointment for 18 months, but practically a guarantee for that person to be on the council for 5.5 years. And for me, coming from, compromising from a position of wanting an election and giving it to the people, that's too far of a swing to the other direction of essentially giving somebody a council seat for 5.5 years. And my last point on this is also, again, I'm looking at what the probabilities are here. I also know that we have people who are talking about running in November 2013 and were talking about running in November 2013 before any of this happened, who are, for example, either current or former planning commissioners, and people who have served on other commissions with the city and been involved in our government. And so to appoint someone, again, who's been on the council before for 18 months, that's completely unfair in my book to someone who is like a former planning commissioner who would like to run in the fall and be on the council. I'm not willing to give that advantage to someone, and that's why I would hold to wanting the condition that whoever we appoint for 18 months would not run in November 2013. The last comment on that, I've talked to enough people, one, even before we had our last meeting, who is interested, who's been on the council before, who would come on the council for 18 months and give us that promise that they wouldn't run in the fall. And it's a well-qualified individual. I'm not saying I would select that individual if we go with an appointment process, but I know they would be in the pool and could give us that stability that we are looking for if we want it.
Mr. Mayor, just I know you have one speaker slip. It might be an appropriate time to have the public comment on this item before you deliberate.
Okay, very good. I know I've got probably more than one person who wants to talk. Ron, are you doing okay on the hearing part?
Reasonably well, Matt. If you could speak a little bit closer to the microphone, that would be helpful.
Okay, will do.
Thanks.
All right. Mr. Gelino, while the other gentleman is filling out his card, do you want to come speak?
Yes, after hearing your comments, especially yours, Mr. Olbert, I would like to request that if you consider former council members for an appointment, that you eliminate those that were not reelected. The people have already chosen that they don't want those people on council any further, so I think they should be eliminated from your pool. And I go back to my further comments that I believe that the power resides in the people constitutionally. You've all sworn to uphold the Constitution, and I think the power to elect an individual should remain with the people. And in that light, I would urge you to make an appointment for the shortest duration possible and hold an election as soon as possible so the will of the people can be done. Thank you.
Thank you. Are you coming up to speak?
Brian Randall, San Carlos, City Council members, gentlemen, you are suggesting that we rely on a person's word not to run for an additional period after the first one. I would suggest you try and make it a legal requirement. Some people do not do as they say they will. They go back on their word. I would not like to rely on a person's word for this important situation. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Discussion. I do want to comment on, Mr. Rubens can correct me if I'm wrong, but I would think, given what happened in San Francisco with Mayor Lee, and they're a much larger city and they're not a general law city, so they have their own charter, and if they couldn't do it, I don't think we could do it either.
It's not an enforceable promise,
right?
So we don't have that discretion.
Very good. Thank you. Discussion.
Well, I'll go first. Can you hear me, Ron?
Yes, I can, Bob. Thank you.
I'll start with Mr. Olbert's points, and I respect the fact that he was able to craft some sort of a compromise in his mind to try to come up with this. It's not an easy situation to do. The The difficulty is by basically, if we say that we really only want to appoint a former city council member, then if I'm not a former city council member, then I'm probably not going to apply. I think that everybody should have the opportunity to apply, only because I think that there are some very capable individuals that I know I've met over the last 6.5 years doing this job, and that have applied for many of the positions that we have on our different commissions and boards. And I think many of those people could come in and do a very good job. So I'm unfortunately not as, that's a hard one for me to look at. It's been said that we should give folks the opportunity to vote, and I certainly agree with that, no question. The difficulty in this case is I think the timing, and also to remember that the voters have entrusted us with making decisions. If we can't have the people vote on every item we have here, we could, but then we're sort of superfluous. I guess this could be considered to be a higher item than others that we deal with. Other people might disagree. I don't know. But we are charged to do the people's work how we see fit. Relative to Mr. Grocot's proposal for November 13th, certainly concur with that and appreciate his compromise on that issue. But having heard, as the city attorney has just indicated, it's an unenforceable promise that people could make. And as we all know, our lives change sometimes day to day. And we've certainly gone through that in the last year relative to the people on the dais here. I don't think anybody could have foreseen these two things happening, let alone one of them, but certainly not both of them, the situations that occurred. So I don't know, again, and legally we can't put a restriction on it. So again, by asking, sort of limiting the pool, it's difficult for me to sort of agree with that situation. I still think the bigger pool is a better situation to have. Anyway, those are my comments for the moment. Thank you.
Mr. Collins?
Yes. That was my problem with Mr. Olbert's suggestion is that, it's nice to say we want to open it up to former city council people, but I can certainly understand why people wouldn't want that, and I detect that there's sort of a visceral reaction to that. Even though I might personally want a former city council member, that may not be the way that people want it. And again, option 2, which to me is the November 13th election, if it does come on that restriction, we can't legally ask people, and I would ask people to think about the fact that, if we had that policy in place when Mr. Malpe was the interim city manager while we were looking for somebody else, and we said that we weren't going to consider him for the full-time position, we wouldn't have gotten him. We would have, instead we got to evaluate him on the job, and I think the public will be able to evaluate that person on the job. So that's, to me, it's important to open it up and to also give people enough time to show the kind of leadership that they're going to bring, the kind of contributions that they're going to bring. And then the other thing that, we haven't even talked about is the cost issue. And that's still an issue with me because we just had a budget meeting where we were talking about cutting $20,000 out of the Healthy Cities Tutoring Project and cutting our support for the Chamber, which provides a lot of services for the city. And so in light of that fact, $50,000 becomes a much larger factor in this whole process.
Sounds like we're right back to where we were Monday night. I don't see any...
can I also add that I have an enormous amount of respect for all of you on the council. I think we're all trying to do the right thing. I think we're all trying to respect the wishes of the people. We just have different opinions, and unfortunately, this process is democracy, as Mr. Ober pointed out, is on one of our meetings is not a pretty process. Sometimes it's just messy, and I'm sorry that we can't agree on this, but I can't reconcile myself to two equally unappealing options to me, I guess is the best way to put it.
Go ahead.
Well, I guess I'll perhaps put my foot in it a little bit here, because I think we may need that just to try and move the discussion forward. One way of looking at the alternative proposed compromises that were just teed up and then arguments were presented against them is, since they both came from the side of the table that, or the side of this particular table that wanted to have, expressed on Monday, wanted to have an earlier rather than a later election, I would ask my colleagues, Councilmember Grisilli and Councilmember Collins, what they would propose as a compromise from where we are on their side of the table. And I fully recognize the fact that as the City Council has presented to us, the default option basically, if a decision is not reached, goes with that side of the table. And so one approach is to say, well, we don't really need to offer a compromise because that's what's going to happen. And what I would remind folks is, what I would remind all of us, is there's an implicit assumption there. And that is that if people are willing to run the risk that the council will operate with only 4 people for the next 18 months, that's probably a true analysis. If that's an assumption that people are depending upon, that may not be correct. And that might be the basis of perhaps proposing some alternative compromise. And I'd love to hear one if there is one. I don't, and if there's not, that's fine too, but I just love to make sure that we hear one if there is one.
Anything, Bob?
Well, I think the difficulty is that because of the way we're aligned, if you prefer the shorter period, so to speak, you can expand, and because you could like in your case, you expanded it to November 13, and you with hopefully a caveat that people wouldn't run. If you're on the side that I'm standing on, November 13 is like the grail. I mean, that's just because I think it should because of the dollars and the stability and some other things and the turnover. So there's not a lot. I don't think there's a lot of options on our side if we stick with November 13 being the most important aspect of that side. I don't know what Councilmember Collins' opinion is on that or either, but mine is that November 13th is the bigger day. So if I stick with that date, there are no ways for me to come back, because there are unless I come back and say we'll appoint somebody for 6 months and in November 2012 we'll appoint somebody else for 12 months, and that throws the stability one out the door. There's not a lot of way to come back, so to speak, at least in my mind. So I don't really have another option in this case. I can't see how, in my own mind, how there is a compromise area for it. Not trying to say that I haven't thought about it, but I can't see how it would work if I stick to that November 13th date.
Yeah, is it all right?
Yes, go ahead. Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I had thought about a lot of alternatives, but to me it keeps coming back to the fact that you get a better pool of candidates for the position if you have a longer period to serve, and if you don't have this this request, which is really what it is. It's a request for people not to run. I know it's not legally binding, but still, everyone we've ever asked to honor that pledge has always honored it. And, that would, I think you'd have a lot of hesitancy in a candidate to violate that pledge. But before we go any further, can I ask City Attorney a question?
Go ahead.
If we're at impasse today, is there any option for any additional special meetings before our next regularly scheduled meeting, so that we could meet all of us in person as a council again? I've felt a little bit of it a disadvantage being on the other side of the country these last few days.
If no action is taken tonight on this, you can set special meetings, or you can put these on two. There's two more regular meetings where the subject could be put on the agenda.
Okay, I would be agreeable to either, but at this point, I'm at a loss to suggest something that is an acceptable alternative. Because I was just thinking, if I were to agree with Mr. Olbert's proposal, there would be two other people opposed to that, and if I agree to Mr. Grocot's proposal, there's two other people opposed to that. So I'm not sure what happens by one of us changing our mind.
If I may, Mr. Mayor, I think that it would behoove us, before we adjourn for today and perhaps punt this a little bit further down the road, that we perhaps consider some motions on the alternatives that were proposed and see whether or not there is support there. That's just my thought, but I wouldn't necessarily want to prejudge that.
Although I'm hearing Mr. Collins' difficulty with, he's not here, but he is here.
That's true.
And we do have 2 meetings where we could have this scheduled regularly. My feeling on it is we've checked in. We've checked in. We've given our positions. We've publicly, stated what we're thinking about and where we are. And since we do have the 60 days, one of the major reasons for doing this now, today, in the with the discomfort of having Ron in Florida, was primarily to give the city attorney a chance to get back to us. And one of the major factors here is the time factor that he has let us know about. So I'm comfortable with, we've accomplished what we've accomplished today. I hear Mr. Collins' discomfort, and I don't mind rescheduling this for May 29th. Then if we're at loggerheads still, then we can always, then we're looking at June, and then we're looking at, something that gets really tight. I understand, but I don't see the need for a special meeting, and I don't see necessarily the need myself to continue on with this meeting given the information we've been given. Yes, sir.
2 comments, if I may. One is, I see the sense of that. I would ask the council to consider perhaps postponing the launch of the interview process. I'm not opposed to continuing to allow people to submit their names. I'm just saying that perhaps we ought to make sure that people understand we haven't decided this sort of key issue first about how long the appointment would be. The other point I wanted to make is in response to something that Councilmember Grisilli said. And I just want to be absolutely clear about this. And Bob, I want you to understand that I'm going to be very blunt here, but I'm trying not to be personal. I'm not personalizing it, okay? One of the things you said was that, if I heard you correctly, was that November 2013, because of the issues the factors you've talked about, is very, very critically important to you. And therefore, you didn't see how there could be much room for moving away from it. I just want to make it clear, speaking for myself, I offered up the compromise that I did in the spirit of trying to find a way that the council could move forward together on this. But please have no doubt whatsoever, the idea of deferring an election and deferring the people's ability to choose who sits up on this dais is absolute anathema to me. Okay? It is in my opinion, personal opinion, it is a terrible thing to do. I would support it in some situations. I would not be silly enough to say, well, we have to have a special election when the normally scheduled election is going to be 2 months from now, because that would make no sense at all. But in this particular situation, in my mind, it makes no sense whatsoever in a democratic system to do this. I respect that other people feel differently about that. I truly do. I just want to make sure that my colleagues understand that my willingness to compromise is not because I do not hold the issues that I raised on Monday very dear, as dear to me as those other issues that you raised are dear to you. It's simply because there's a famous expression which says that people who admire laws and sausages shouldn't watch either of them being made. My compromise was in the spirit of that, is I would sort of look the other way to some extent on my beliefs, because I think it's important to acknowledge other people's beliefs. It's also important not to man the ramparts on things when there's the possibility of finding, in my opinion, of course, what was a perhaps workable compromise. But I just wanted to be clear about that my willingness to move away from an early election or some of the other things that I said, since I wasn't moving away from an early election per se, is not because I suddenly devalue those principles. It's just a recognition that in practice, sometimes you have to give.
You know, and I respect your opinion, and I respect that you have principles, and I think all of us up here have principles, depending on how you approach it. There's a lot of factors that go into things, and as you mentioned about compromise, that's exactly what, in a way, we're all going to be doing here if this plays out. It's going to be compromise, just the way it is. So certainly respect, what you have to say, and hopefully we all go our way in our ideas and our plans. This isn't the first time that voters having a choice has come up in this council. And another time it came up, we didn't allow the voters to vote on an item. It wasn't for an election, or it wasn't for a person, but it was an election, and we didn't give it to them. And that was a difficult situation. And I was on the other side of that argument at that time. But this time I'm on this side. It happens to go both ways. Mr. Mayor, the only point one quick point I was going to make. What is if I could, through the chair, what is the deadline for the applications right now?
The current deadline for the applications is May 23rd, and should it be the desire of the council to bring this back on May 29th, I'd likely extend it several days longer so as people aren't operating under such a tight constraint.
Right. That was one point. I was appreciative of that comment. And the other thing is, the only problem I have with extending it past, let's say, May 29th, is that there are some people who may decide to apply for a position if it's a 6-month position. And there are other people who may apply if it's an 18-month position, but they may not all want to do both. So I think the sooner we can I know we're not deciding per se, because it's being decided almost indirectly for us, but when the decision is final, then people know what they're applying for, is my only point. So I have no problem meeting on the 29th and discussing it again, but I would recommend that would be the end of the discussion so that people could decide what to do, expend it maybe for 2 or 3 days after that to the early part of June, and then start having, by the first week or the end of the first week of June, having interviews, or depending on what the council decides. But if we keep extending it, people are going to not know whether they're going to be applying for a short term or a long term. That was my only comment.
I have a comment to that. But Mr. Collins, any comments?
No, not at the moment.
Okay. Well, I'm going to open up here a little bit. Number one, first I want to find out, before we close the meeting, I just want to make sure I heard Mr. Olbert clearly, because both Mr. Grisilli and Mr. Collins have repeated it in a way that they heard it, and I just want to make sure that this is right. That you were saying that we would call for an election for 2012, and this is the way I wrote it down, but look for appointment of former council member. Were you meaning that we would exclusively look for former council members, or were you meaning that that there might be the leaning towards that by all of us, but we're all free to choose however we want, and the application poll would be completely open?
Let me see if I can I did kind of gloss over that. Let me see if I can explain that.
So he can
Let me see if I can explain that a little bit more clearly. First off, personally, I would be fine not putting any constraints on the pool at all. Not even talking about weighting different factors differently. Okay. That was actually, and I may have read the situation wrong, that was the heart of what I was trying to compromise on, because I had thought, based on the comments Monday night, that concerns over requiring stability and a high level of experience to hit the ground running were important issues to some folks. And so I was trying to provide for that by saying, well, if that's important, then let's focus on that. And that I said at the end, I would be willing to basically defer to that importance, even though I personally don't necessarily feel it that strongly. So I did actually say it, Mr. Mayor, the way you relayed it, but the reality is I'm pretty flexible on that. I was just trying to signal that might be a potential way that we could break the impasse, and that I personally would be willing to say, well, even though I kind of like to have as broad a net as possible, if narrowing the net to highly experienced people, giving that a very important weight, was important to others, I'd be happy to go along with that.
So in other words, if we came down to a couple of candidates who were former council members that we were discussing, you would compromise on two things, if I understand it. One, you'd be willing to pick a person who had been a former council member and not even ask for, it wouldn't even come up in the interviews, because we wouldn't be talking about whether or not they could run in 2013 or not. You wouldn't want that to be a question at all about the incumbency issue. You would just let that pass altogether.
That is correct, and that too is an element of what I was trying to compromise on. In other words, I think we all, myself included, Monday night clearly expressed what our personal preferences were.
Right.
I was looking for a way to say which things am I willing to move on. I also want to emphasize, by the way, that in talking about saying I would basically go along with whatever the view of my colleagues was on picking an experienced person, I did mention in there, and it's very important to me, I would also ask, if we went that route, that we look for somebody that everybody who's currently on the council right now can work with effectively, okay? Because I think that's very important. That was sort of the only remaining caveat that I had. And I may not have clearly expressed that 10 minutes ago.
Well, just so the rest of the council knows, given Mr. Olbert's restatement and what he's looking for, I'd be willing to go there too, because I've been one saying over and over again, I don't want to give a former council member the advantage of incumbency through an appointment, and so I suppose that would be an area I would be willing to compromise on, because the other piece that at least I would be getting is that we would have an election, we'd have it earlier, we'd be giving the brunt of the term, if you will, to the people to decide, because the appointment would be for 6 months, not even 6 months, and we talked about last Monday night, we've got some breaks coming up, and so the number of meetings we're talking about that this person would be appointed for would be fairly limited. And the other thing that just came to mind is it is an odd situation, and to put somebody through the ropes of running a campaign for 1 year and then running a campaign again 4 years later, or for the 4-year term 1 year later, that in itself is a lot of work. So, if they want to do that, I suppose let them do it. So I'm with Mr. Olbert. I'd be willing to compromise on not saying anything about incumbency, and really just open up the pool to everybody. And if it comes down that it's a former council member that we're selecting, I'd be willing to select that and forget about giving them a leg up or not. Looking at it the other way, though, if it's an 18-month period, for myself, I'm still holding to that position because, again, as I said before, we wouldn't. I'm pretty sure we would not be selecting somebody for 18 months. We would, in essence, be selecting somebody for 5.5 years, and that to me is just, it's not fair to the people, and it's also not fair to the other candidates who may be running.
Through the chair, if I could make, I'm sorry, I mean, are you finished? I didn't mean
No,
to
but go ahead.
Oh, I mean, I certainly understand, what you just said, especially the last part of it. But we just had an election where Mr. Olbert and Mr. Collins were elected, and an incumbent was defeated. I think the people are going to look at if someone is appointed for 18 months and that individual wants to run, they're going to look at the individual's record, and they're going to say, how did they vote on this? How did they vote on that? What did they do in the 18 months? Which is certainly a period of time that I think you can judge people, not as long as 4 years, but certainly have a judgment on them. So I don't know that, again, I would have that in my mind, personally, again, just my opinion, that it's an automatic. Because in today's society, there doesn't seem to be a lot of automatics, of people, automatically moving on with a position. So, and the other thing I was going to mention, just as an aside, and I think we'll get to it, is if at the end of the meeting today, if we could just discuss that May 29th point that I made relative to how long we're going to keep talking about, the item. So anyway, thank you.
Okay, yeah.
Mr. Mayor?
Yes, sir. Go ahead.
If I may just, Mr. Grisilli's comments reminded me of interesting factoid that I learned from talking to my former colleague, Seth Rosenblatt, that I wanted to bring up, because I think it's absolutely correct to say, the data clearly shows that incumbency is not a guarantee of being reelected. But what Seth Rosenblatt explained to me, he was first elected to the San Carlos School Board back in 2007, and he ran for reelection this past November in 2011. When he ran the first time, he spent countless hours campaigning. He spent, I believe, in excess of $9,000, might have been close to $10,000 on the election. The November 2011 election, he spent very little time on, and he spent a grand total of $24. That is the power. Now, part of that is because it's true, people got to see Seth in action. But part of that is the value of incumbency.
And just to tag on to that, I would agree. When I ran had my first successful campaign, that is in 2001, I worked my tail off. When I ran in 2005 for re-election, I had some of the same people helping me, and I went out and did some walking, but I didn't spend nearly amounts of money, and didn't campaign nearly as hard, and got about 1,500 more votes than I got when I was first elected in 2001. So, and of course, this last time when Bob and I and Andy got onto the dais, our re-election, there was really no competition, so can't really talk about that one. But I would agree with you in what Seth has said about incumbency. There is, it's not automatic. I agree with you, Mr. Grisilli, and that's been displayed most recently. But I do believe it's an advantage, and I think it's especially an advantage in the way that I've drawn it up. That if there's an open seat, if there's actually an open seat, and especially if there would be two open seats, if you and I both decided not to run, whoever we appoint has a huge advantage, I believe. And there's not, I don't really think, hearing what we're saying, I think someone who's in the seat for 18 months could fairly keep their head low to make sure they don't make any mistakes. Yes, there's things we have to vote on, but I think in the case that we've seen most recently, the history of what we're looking at with particularly Mr. Royce, I think one could argue that some of that was not just as a council member, but as a mayor driving an agenda that was, we've all, Ron said it last time, it was controversial, the things that he was driving for. Having our fire department handled the way that it was, and going to Redwood City, having the police department handled the way that it was, and going to the sheriff's department, and then we revisited the turf issue during that period. Those were all big issues that weighed heavily on the public and weighed heavily on the council. So regardless of what we may think of those issues and how we voted on them and so forth, yes, I think the public weighed in. Does someone who's on the council for 18 months is not going to, will not sit in the mayor's seat, will not be driving an agenda, will just be voting on things that come across the dais? Will the public weigh on them that heavily? I don't think so. So I think it's a little bit different situation. I do want to say also, because it's been brought up, on the money issue, and Christine's given us I think probably a conservative estimate of $50,000. It could be far less than that. To me, I know it's money. I know it's money we could spend on other things. But when you open up a city hall and say, we're going to sit here as a government, you better be budgeting for elections, because it's part of doing business. That's like a homeowner having a house and owning a house. You've got your mortgage payment, your tax bill, and maintenance costs that you better be looking at. Otherwise, you shouldn't be owning a house. Well, you shouldn't have a city government if you can't afford having elections once in a while, and even special elections, because things do happen, as we've aptly seen here in the last year, where things like this come up. It should just simply be in our budget to pay for elections when they happen, and even when they happen that at times we don't expect them. It's the cost of doing business. To your point on the deadline, quite frankly, I don't care what the applicants are thinking about the time period. To me, I'm looking for somebody who's, for that, especially the interim period, the appointment period, I'm looking for someone who is simply wants to serve the city. They are not looking at their own political career and how long they're going to be on the council and so forth. To me, the person who's coming forward to take an appointment, and especially if there's someone who is willing to come forward, take the appointment, and not run in November, they are a person with a very good heart who simply wants to serve this city because they love it and they want to help us out. That's what I saw the last time we did this after Omar's passing, and when Brad Lewis came forward. He had no spirit about, I'm going to forward my political career by doing this. He just simply loves this city and wanted to give his service to us. And that's the kind of person, quite frankly, regardless of what the candidate pool looks like, when if we end up going out for applicants, that's the kind of person I'm going to be looking for.
Well, through the chair, perhaps you misunderstood what I said, and perhaps I didn't say it properly. And no interest, no direction of 6 months or 18 months relative to politics whatsoever. But people have lives. Mr. Lewis had a life that had a 6-month window. If it had an 18-month window, I'm sort of thinking he's not going to run for that one, because he's had other things. He had something else that he had to do. So that's the point I was making. It has nothing to do with politics. But our lives are, sometimes we have a period of time where the next 6 months I've got time. The next year and a half, I don't have time. Mm-hmm. And that's my point. It wasn't anything to do with politics. I just want to make sure that point was made. Seriously, it's really a matter of everyone's personal life, of how they can fit a job like this that we all know takes a lot of extra hours. How does it fit into a time? And what kind of a job do I have today, or what kind of a family situation do I have today? And can I, 6 months, I guess I can do it, maybe I can. 18 months, maybe I can do it, maybe I can't. That's the point I was trying to make. So I just want to be clear on that.
Very good.
Thank you.
Mr. Collins, you've been awfully quiet over there in Florida. How are things?
I've been enjoying the discussion. I agree with a lot of things that everybody has said. I think we're all in agreement that we want someone who has the city's best interest in mind, that doesn't really have any ulterior motives. Ulterior motives is really not a good word or a good term to use, but doesn't have any particular agenda. We've been very fortunate. I think we got a pass last year in that, as unfortunate as Omar's passing was, it conveniently came right before a regularly scheduled election. so we had, and we had probably what everyone would agree was the most perfect person to step in, someone who didn't have any designs and rerunning again. It was sort of a perfect alignment that came out of a tragedy like that. But if we have one this November, we've got 3 elections in 3 years. And, there's something about that we are basically having someone now who's just, we're just going to be finishing out a term, and I don't think it's necessary, and I'm not convinced otherwise that it's necessary to have an election, to spend the money, to demonstrate this democratic process of ours. When we did it last year, we're going to do it next year. People have lots of opportunities to vote, and they have lots of opportunities to apply. That's why I think that not having a restriction on people who are considering serving opens it up to the most people. I want the most options for the most people, and that's sort of the driving force behind what I've been talking about.
Okay, thank you. Other comments? I'm just going to throw this in here, and as I see it, fellas, we're on item A right now. We do need to discuss, and Bob's hit on it a little bit, item B, discussion of method to advertise the vacancy. If I'm going to say this, that we have a meeting on the 29th, we can schedule this for, and I'm fine with that, as I said previously. If we can't come to a decision then, and we end up with the default position, I feel pretty strongly that it leaves us in a questionable position of making an appointment. In other words, if we can't even decide on when to have an election and we rely on the law's default, then we exclude ourselves from making a decision on an appointment. We lose the right, because we should be able to make the first decision prior to making the second. And if we can't make the first, I just don't see how we have that right to make the second. So,
well, through the chair, I mean, I certainly understand, your principle on that, but the law, I think, speaks a little differently, and certainly the law of logic speaks a little differently. We're having difficulty on some budget items, possibly, and some other items. And you and I served on a fire board together with 4 people, and it wasn't a happy day. It wasn't a pleasant experience.
Sometimes.
And I think you could agree to that. And you have the reason you have all. I don't know that there's a city council or town council or supervisorial group in the world that has an equal number. Maybe there is. And I'm sure people will be calling me tomorrow and telling me all the people that do it, but it's just got to be an odd number. And I think it's our responsibility, as long as we're not breaking laws, because I don't want to break laws, to make sure that we stand up and appoint somebody. And that's just the way it is. We're going to, whether we have it in 12 or 13, we're still going to have to do it. And to me, that's just one of our major responsibilities. But thank you.
Mr. Mayor, thank you. All excellent arguments, all excellent points to support the notion of why we ought to find a compromise approach that lets us move forward.
So on the item that Mr. Grisilli was talking about a little earlier about the deadline, and I think the staff maybe still needs a little direction on that. I talked to a council member in Pacifica. He actually called me to let me know that they had just been through something similar and give me the rundown on how they did it. Now, one of the things they did was they went ahead and advertised and called for letters of intent from candidates. And we have the time, and we could do the same thing, even with it being unknown exactly how we're going to move forward, that we could just go ahead and call for letters of intent and make the deadline the 29th, and we would have those available to us for our discussion on the at our May 29th meeting.
Mr. Mayor?
Yes, sir.
May I ask that if we're going to call for the letters, is it possible that we can ask that the applicants indicate whether or not they are interested in a 6-month appointment, an 18-month appointment, or either appointment? Could we ask that?
We could add something we could, how others feel about it. That'd be fine, yeah.
Okay.
I guess, Mr. Collins, the only question I have is, and what reason would you want to know that?
Well, simply because I don't know how this is going to come out.
I see.
And you want a pool of candidates, and depending on how we resolve this, you want to know what your applicant's intentions are.
See, I approach it the other way. I like to tell people what they're getting into, as opposed to them telling me what they're getting into or what they'd like to do. In other words, we have to set a time to interview people. If they know that it's a 6-month appointment, they may apply, they may not apply. If it's an 18-month appointment, they may apply or not apply. If it's confusing to them, maybe they won't apply at all.
Mm-hmm.
So my point is, set the date specific. If it's the 29th, we want to talk about this again, we'll talk about it. But in my opinion, that's the drop-dead date for this council. And then if the deadline is the applications is that day or a few days after that or something like that, that's how I'd like to do. Otherwise, we're going to be marching into the summer, and we're going to have another meeting and another meeting where we're not going to have 5 people. And that's the concern I have. I was hopeful that, and I still think it's possible, by July 1st to have a person sitting in this up here with us. And that's what I'm trying to get at. But again, maybe other people have different ideas on that. But I think you have to eventually stop talking about something, whether you can decide or not. And I appreciate the frustration of not being able to make a decision, but it's going to be made, unfortunately, the word is default, I guess, or made for us. And that's the end of that. And we have to move on.
And I don't dispute that. I'm just saying that I don't know the way the meeting on the 29th is going to come out. I'm fine with having a person selected by July 1st, but it might just be helpful to know. I'm fine with setting the deadlines. I have no problem with that. Okay. And all I'm saying is it might be helpful to know.
Well, whatever my colleagues want to do, I just wanted to voice my opinion. Thank you.
To jump in here, I think one of the things that Mr. Collins' point would bring to us is exactly what your point was earlier, that some people may want to put in a letter and say, you know, given my work situation, family situation, I'm really, what I'm putting in my, your deadline is the 29th. You guys don't know if you're going to be doing a 6-month appointment in an election in 2012 or if you're going to be doing an 18-month appointment. I'm only interested in 6 months because of my family situation. I'm going on a vacation, this summer. So,
It's either, I mean, you either go one way or the other. And if we go that way, it's probably a good idea. I don't necessarily want to do that, but if we go that way, because if you go the other way, then you let them decide what to do.
Now, I suppose the other thing to do is just put out the call. The deadline's on the 29th. We don't know what the term is going to be, and just let what Mr. Collins is asking for be prescribed in a letter, just be part of our conversation with the candidates, is, which are you looking for? Is there any reason you couldn't serve for 18 months, et cetera?
One last point, if I could. I tend, now that I'm thinking more about it, there's no reason why it couldn't be on there saying, would you be willing to apply for 18 months or for 6 months? Check the box, do the, put it in there, fine. Then we'd know, we'd absolutely know.
Yeah.
Excuse me, Mr. Olbert.
What I was going to suggest is that, personally, I don't have a strong preference whether we ask for that information or not. If we do ask for it, I personally would just like to ask staff to make sure that it's clear that we're asking for an indication of people's sense, because I could easily see somebody checking one box and getting partway through the process and saying, you know what, if they're only going to do the other alternative, I'd like to put my name in for that too, which in my mind sort of devalues the value of the information a bit. The other point I'd like to make is actually there's an argument to not collecting the information, even though we are dealing with an uncertain situation. That's part and parcel of being up on this dais, is that things are often confusing and you're not sure what's going to happen and whatnot. And so to the extent that that's part of the reality of serving in these jobs. Maybe that's ought to be a factor in people's thinking about whether they apply.
Again, I just make the point that some people might not be able to do it for 18 months because of a situation. So there's no sense in them thinking they, anyway, whatever, point made.
Mr. City Manager, do you need any more direction on item B? We can make a motion that we would extend the invite simply to the 29th in much the same wording that you used already, that you gave us?
I think I've actually got enough direction, and I think I can even save you the motion. I set the date, so I'm perfectly comfortable extending it to the 29th, and we can update the language and ask them to specifically indicate whether or not they'd be looking at a 6-month, an 18-month, or both, and that it's not not binding, that, it's just trying to get a sense of where they're at.
And we need no motion on that.
I don't think we need a motion on that.
Very good. Okay. Is there anything else then?
Mr. Mayor, may I just ask a question, please? If your deadline is May 29th and your meeting is May 29th, how do we possibly schedule the interviews if the folks are coming in at 10 to 5?
Excuse me. We would not be conducting interviews on the 29th. We would just be making that the deadline for applications.
Got it. Thank you.
Yes. Good question, though. Because as Mr. Albert said earlier, we do a lot of confusing things up here. We want to make sure we're clear.
And I would, again, through the chair, I would just, hopefully, on the 29th, whatever happens, I would, in my opinion, that would be the end date so that we could start scheduling even that evening when those interviews could happen in early June, but just my opinion. So,
in other words, you would not want to see this item continued again to June 11th, even though we have the time.
I wouldn't do it personally, because then you're going to, in my mind, we're going to bump up against, well, again, in my mind, I'd like July 1st to be the person comes on. You just push it back now that from the 11th through the 1st, we have to figure out when those dates are for interviews. And if depending on the pool, it might be 5 people, might be 10 people, might be 15 people. It takes, again, we're going to have another council meeting on the 25th, I believe, right? Is that the next 11th and the 20? If the 11th is the next council meeting. So I just think we bump into a lot of different things. But this is mine. I just think if we had a meeting the other night and we came to an impasse. We had a meeting today, and we came to an impasse. We have a meeting on May 29th. If we come to an impasse, that's 3. I don't know. How many more do we need?
Are you going to make that as a motion? Because otherwise, it's kind of like the promise we're asking the candidates to give us, or not. We could sit here and say that, but come the 29th, we still at loggerheads. We could still schedule another meeting. Legally, if we're following the law, we got the time.
We can, Mr. Mayor, it's a recommendation that I have. After you deadlock 3 times in a row,
right,
and all the time we've had to think about it and talk about the different options and compromises that have been offered, in my opinion, it's done, let's go. But again, you may have a different opinion on that. So
you're just asking us to keep that in mind, but you don't necessarily want to make that into a motion. Okay, very good.
I'm just requesting through the chair that we consider that, because we're just going to keep talking about this. So anyway,
very good.
Thank you.
Okay, I understand. Mr. Collins, anything else?
No, sir.
Okay, we're adjourned. We'll use the hammer.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ron.
Thanks, Ron.